March 3, 1943, 460 nautical miles northwest of Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Edward Larner pushed his B-25 Mitchell into a shallow dive, the twin Wright Cyclone engines roaring as the altimeter unwound through 500 feet, then 300, then 200. Ahead, spread across the turquoise waters of the Bismarck Sea, 8 Japanese transport ships and 8 destroyers steamed in tight formation toward Leh. Nearly 7,000 soldiers crowded the transports below decks, unaware they had minutes to live. Larner's Mitchell was not the aircraft that North American aviation had designed. The transparent bombardier's nose was gone, replaced with solid sheet metal. Where a single bombardier had once crouched with his Norden bombsight, 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns now bristled forward. 4 more 50s jutted from external blisters along the fuselage, 12 heavy machine guns pointing straight ahead. The firepower of nearly 3 P-38 Lightning fighters concentrated in a single medium bomber. The Japanese had never encountered anything like it. They could not have known that this weapon, this commerce destroyer, had been born not in a factory or engineering laboratory, but in a makeshift workshop at Eagle Farms Airfield in Brisbane, Australia. Designed not by aeronautical engineers, but by a 53-year-old retired Navy Chief Petty Officer who had learned to fly on his own time between engine maintenance shifts 2 decades earlier. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. The men who flew with him called him Pappy. And in the space of 8 months, from the summer of 1942 to this moment above the Bismarck Sea, he had transformed the Pacific Air War through sheer mechanical ingenuity and an intimate understanding of what it took to kill ships from the air. The Japanese convoy steaming below had sailed from Rabaul, confident in their fighter cover and anti-aircraft defences. They would learn, in the next 12 minutes, that confidence meant nothing against a weapon system that should never have existed. A weapon created by salvaging machine guns from crashed fighters and bolting them into bombers that standard doctrine insisted should attack from 10,000 feet, not 200. The mathematics were about to become horrifyingly clear. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 7,000 men, against 13 aircraft modified by a mechanic who refused to accept that bombing from altitude was the only way to sink ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 16 months earlier, Paul Gunn had been living a quiet expatriate life in Manila, flying Beech 18 passenger aircraft for Philippine Airlines. At 50 years old, his days of military service seemed permanently behind him. 20 years in the United States Navy, from 1918 to 1939. Enlisted as an aviation mechanic during the First World War's final months, worked his way up through the enlisted ranks while teaching himself to fly during off-duty hours. Selected as a naval aviation pilot in 1923, one of the enlisted naval aviators before the service, required officers for flight status. He had served with Fighting Squadron 1B, the Top Hatters, one of the Navy's oldest fighter squadrons, flew from carriers in the Pacific, served as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola, retired as a Chief Petty Officer in December 1939 after 21 years of service, started an airline in Hawaii. Then moved to the Philippines to establish charter flying operations throughout the islands. His wife Clara and their 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, lived with him in Manila. The job was good. The pay was better than Navy Chief's salary. The Philippines offered a comfortable life for American expatriates in those last peaceful years before the world caught fire. December 8, 1941, Manila time. Same day as Pearl Harbor across the international dateline, Japanese aircraft struck Clark Field and other American installations across Luzon. Within hours, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively destroyed. Within days, Japanese ground forces were landing at multiple points across the islands. The Philippine Commonwealth and its American defenders began a fighting withdrawal toward the Bataan Peninsula. Gunn immediately volunteered his services. The Army Air Corps commissioned him as a captain, putting his intimate knowledge of Philippine geography and his flying skills to immediate use. He flew reconnaissance missions. He flew transport missions. As American and Filipino forces retreated into Bataan, Gunn flew medical supplies and ammunition into besieged positions, threading his way through Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire to deliver crucial supplies to men who had no other lifeline. On one mission, flying a beach aircraft loaded with medical supplies into Bataan, Gunn encountered Japanese Zero fighters. The transport had no defensive armament. Gunn dove to wave-top height and flew through a Japanese anti-aircraft barrage, betting the gunners would cease fire rather than risk hitting their own fighters. The Zeros pulled up. Gunn delivered his supplies and flew out the same way he had entered. For this action and others during the defense of Bataan, he would later receive the Distinguished Flying Cross, but by late December 1941, it was clear the Philippines could not be held. Critical personnel were being evacuated to Australia to establish command structure for continued resistance. In late December, Gunn flew key Army Air Force officers south to Mindanao, then to the Dutch East Indies, then to Australia. He landed at Darwin with a handful of officers and his own survival. His family remained behind in Manila. Clara Gunn and their 4 children, trapped in a city that would fall to Japanese occupation within weeks. Gunn landed in Australia, knowing his wife and children faced internment, knowing he could do nothing to protect them, knowing the only path back to Manila led through the destruction of Japanese military power in the Southwest Pacific. The Army Air Force personnel who evacuated to Australia in late 1941 and early 1942 found themselves in a desperate situation. Equipment was scarce. Aircraft were obsolete or worn out. Spare parts did not exist. Doctrine developed for European warfare did not apply to the vast distances and maritime focus of the Pacific. The Japanese had momentum, numerical superiority, and combat experience their opponents lacked. American bombers in Australia and New Guinea were attempting to strike Japanese shipping and installations using standard medium-altitude bombing tactics. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells would approach targets at 10 to 12,000 feet, release bombs, and depart. The problem was immediately obvious. Bombing ships from 10,000 feet was nearly impossible. Ships could maneuver. By the time bombs released from altitude reached sea level, 20 to 30 seconds had elapsed. A destroyer making 25 knots could move more than 1,000 feet in that time. Hitting a maneuvering ship from altitude required extraordinary luck. The losses were unsustainable. American bombers flying at 10 to 12,000 feet entered the optimal envelope for both Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could climb to 15,000 feet in less than 7 minutes. Japanese anti-aircraft guns were most effective between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. American bombers were being torn apart while achieving minimal results. By mid-1942, Japanese shipping continued to flow freely through the Southwest Pacific. Reinforcements reached New Guinea. Supplies sustained forward bases. Every convoy that reached its destination meant Japanese forces grew stronger, while American and Australian forces struggled with inadequate logistics. Lieutenant Colonel William Benn of the 43rd Bomb Group had developed an alternative approach. Flying B-17 bombers, Benn's crews experimented with minimum altitude attacks, releasing bombs from 200 to 500 feet. At that altitude, bombs took only seconds to reach the water. Ships had no time to maneuver. But the B-17 had no forward-firing armament beyond a single 50-caliber gun in the nose. Japanese gunners on ships could fire freely at approaching bombers without suppression. Benn's crews began attacking at night, when moonlight provided enough illumination to see targets, but darkness concealed the attacking aircraft. The tactic worked, but night operations limited the number of missions that could be flown. Daylight, low-altitude attacks in B-17s resulted in heavy losses. General George Kenney arrived in Australia in August 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was an innovator, willing to discard doctrine that did not work and embrace unorthodox solutions. He reviewed the tactical situation and reached immediate conclusions. High-altitude bombing against ships was ineffective. Low-altitude bombing worked, but required forward-firing armament to suppress defensive fire. Existing aircraft lacked such armament. Kenney's chief of staff introduced him to Captain Paul Gunn. The 53-year-old former Navy chief was working at Amberley Field near Brisbane, supervising aircraft maintenance. But Gunn had been doing more than maintenance. Using salvaged machine guns from crashed American fighters, Gunn had been modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers belonging to the 3rd Bombardment Group. The A-20 had entered service as a light bomber with a glazed nose for a bombardier. Gunn stripped out the bombardier position entirely. He replaced the transparent nose with solid aluminum. Into the nose, he installed 450 caliber M2 Browning machine guns salvaged from wrecked P-39 Airacobra and P-40 Warhawk fighters. Each gun was mounted to fire straight ahead. 4 guns meant 400 rounds per minute per gun. 1,600 rounds per minute total. 26 rounds per second converging on a single point. When Kenny learned what Gunn was doing, using salvaged parts without authorization, modifying combat aircraft in a makeshift workshop, his response was immediate. He brought Gunn onto his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and ordered him to modify 16 more A-20s. Kenny saw what Gunn had created, a light bomber that could suppress defensive fire while making low-altitude attacks, a commerce destroyer. The modified A-20s flew their first combat mission on September 12, 1942, attacking a Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea. Flying at 200 feet, the A-20s strafed parked aircraft with their nose guns, while dropping parachute-equipped fragmentation bombs. The bombs' parachutes provided enough drag that the attacking aircraft could escape the blast radius even from minimum altitude. The Japanese lost more than 20 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The A-20s returned with minor damage. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to apply the same modification to B-25 Mitchells. The Mitchell was larger than the A-20, with more space in the nose section. Where the A-20 could mount 450s, the Mitchell could mount more. Gunn went to work. The B-25 had been designed with a glazed nose housing the bombardier and his Norden bomb sight. The entire forward fuselage section forward of the pilot's windscreen consisted of transparent panels, providing visibility for bombing runs. Gunn's modification was radical. Remove the entire transparent nose assembly. Replace it with solid sheet aluminum. Install 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, arranged to fire straight ahead. Add 2 more external gun packs on each side of the forward fuselage, each containing 2 additional 50s. 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns total. Gunn worked with Jack Fox, North American Aviation's field technical representative in Australia. Fox had the manufacturer's detailed drawings and structural specifications. Together, Gunn and Fox determined how to mount 8 guns without compromising the aircraft's structural integrity. The gun's recoil had to be absorbed by the airframe. Ammunition feed systems had to be installed. Spent cartridge ejection had to be managed. The first modified B-25 was named Pappy's Folly. Gunn test flew it himself in late 1942. The aircraft handled differently from standard Mitchells. The weight distribution had changed. The solid nose affected aerodynamics. But the modifications held. The guns fired. The aircraft flew. Kenny ordered 12 more Mitchells modified to the same standard. By February 1943, a full squadron of modified B-25's was operational, assigned to the 3rd Attack Group. These were not strafer bombers in the traditional sense. They were commerce destroyers, purpose-built to attack shipping at minimum altitude with maximum firepower. The tactic that would employ these modified Mitchells had been developing in parallel. Skip bombing. The concept was straightforward. Approach the target at extremely low altitude, 50 to 200 feet above the water. At a distance of approximately 1,000 feet from the target, release bombs with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. The bombs would strike the water, skip like flat stones, and impact the side of the ship below the waterline before detonating. The technique required precise altitude and airspeed control. Too high, and the bombs would sink before reaching the target. Too low, and the bombs would detonate immediately on water impact. The ideal approach was at exactly 200 feet altitude at exactly 220 miles per hour. At those parameters, a 500-pound bomb with a 4-second delay fuse would skip once, strike the ship's hull, and penetrate before exploding internally. The modified Mitchells made skip bombing devastatingly effective. The nose guns could fire continuously during the approach, suppressing defensive fire from the target ship. The guns could kill exposed personnel on deck, destroy anti-aircraft gun positions, shatter bridge windows. By the time the Mitchell reached bomb release point, the target ship's defensive fire would be suppressed or eliminated. The bomber could release its skip bombs with minimal interference, then continue strafing as it pulled up and away. American and Australian crews trained intensively on the new tactics throughout late 1942 and early 1943. Skip bombing required precise flying at minimum altitude. Any error meant flying into the water or being caught in bomb blast. Pilots practiced approaches against old hulks moored in Australian harbours. Bombardiers, now serving as gunners, learned to fire the nose guns effectively. The learning curve was steep. Some crews crashed during training, but those who mastered the technique became extraordinarily lethal. By early 1943, Allied intelligence was tracking Japanese convoy movements throughout the Southwest Pacific. Ultra-intercepts provided advance warning of major shipping operations. Coast watchers throughout the islands reported enemy vessel movements. The Allies knew when Japanese reinforcements were sailing and where they intended to land. On February 28, 1943, Allied intelligence reported a major Japanese convoy departing Rabaul bound for Lae, New Guinea. 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, nearly 7,000 troops of the 51st Division embarked. The convoy would sail through the Bismarck Sea, approach the Huon Peninsula, and land reinforcements that would strengthen Japanese positions throughout New Guinea. General Kenny saw the opportunity immediately. A major convoy, sailing through waters within range of Allied airfields. Perfect weather forecast for early March. Every available aircraft in the Southwest Pacific would hit that convoy. High-altitude bombers would strike first, forcing the convoy to maneuver and disperse. Then the commerce destroyers would finish the job. The modified B-25's had been training for 8 months. Now they would face the test they were built for. Major Edward Larner commanded one squadron. Major Donald Hall commanded another. Between them, 13 modified Mitchells would lead the attack. Behind them, modified A-20 Havocks would add their firepower. Australian Beaufighters would strafe to, suppress anti-aircraft fire. B-17 Flying Fortresses would attack from altitude to keep the convoy dispersed. On March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on routine reconnaissance spotted the convoy departing Rabaul at 4 in the afternoon. The convoy was sailing south through St. George's Channel between New Britain and New Ireland. Weather over the Bismarck Sea was deteriorating, with heavy cloud cover moving in from the west. The convoy commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, knew Allied air power would attack once the convoy entered range. The weather would provide some protection. March 2nd brought continuous high-altitude bombing attacks by B-17s, but cloud cover prevented the bombers from achieving significant results. One transport, the Kyokusei Maru, was damaged and turned back toward Rabaul. The remaining 7 transports and 8 destroyers continued south. The convoy would reach Lae by March 4th, if it could survive the next 48 hours. By the evening of March 2nd, the convoy was within range of every Allied aircraft in New Guinea. Kenny issued final orders. At dawn on March 3rd, the commerce destroyers would attack. Every modified Mitchell and Havoc would hit the convoy simultaneously in coordinated waves. The Australian Beaufighters would go in first to suppress anti-aircraft fire, then the Mitchells, then more high-altitude bombers to prevent the convoy from regrouping. March 3rd, 1943, dawn. Clear skies, perfect visibility. The modified B-25's launched from Port Moresby and Dobodura airfields. 13 Mitchells from the 3rd Attack Group. Behind them, modified A-20 Havocks. Behind them, Royal Australian Air Force Bristol Beaufighters. P-38 Lightnings provided fighter cover above. The entire strike force rendezvoused over Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua and turned northwest toward the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy was exactly where reconnaissance of aircraft had reported. 7 transport ships in tight formation, 8 destroyers screening the transports, approximately 100 Japanese Zero and Oscar fighters providing air cover above, more than 300 anti-aircraft guns on the ships below. The convoy had been sailing for 3 days. The troops crammed below decks believed they were nearly safe. Leh was less than 50 miles ahead, just a few more hours. At approximately 10 in the morning, the bow fighters dove toward the convoy from the south. Flying at wave-top height, the Australian twin-engine fighters strafed the transport ships with 20mm cannons and 50-caliber machine guns. The attack came so fast the Japanese barely had time to respond. The bow fighters targeted bridge structures and anti-aircraft positions, killing officers and gun crews, creating chaos across the convoy. Before the Japanese could recover, the modified Mitchells arrived. 13 B-25's in a staggered line formation, approaching from multiple directions at 200 feet altitude. Major Edward Larner's aircraft led the first wave. His 8 nose guns opened fire at 1,500 yards, tracers reaching across the water toward the transport Teo Maru. The guns fired continuously as Larner closed the distance. Bridge windows shattered, anti-aircraft gun crews fell, deck cargo erupted in flames. At 1,000 feet from the Teo Maru, Larner's bombardier released 2 500-pound bombs with 4-second delay fuses. The bombs struck the water at precisely the correct angle, skipped once, and slammed into the transport's hull at the waterline. Larner pulled up and banked right as his bombs detonated inside the ship. The Teo Maru's hull split open. Seawater rushed into the lower decks where soldiers had been packed into cargo holds. The ship began listing immediately. Lieutenant Ralph Dello followed Larner, targeting the Kyokuyo Maru. 8 nose guns blazing, Dello's Mitchell raked the transport superstructure before releasing bombs that punched through the hull below the waterline. The Kyokuyo Maru was carrying Colonel Teishi Nakamura, operations officer of the 51st Division. Nakamura watched from the bridge as American bombers materialized at masthead height, their wings sparkling with muzzle flashes. His ship shuddered under repeated impacts. Then came the underwater explosions that he knew meant the vessel was finished. One by one, the modified Mitchells made their attacks. Each bomber approached at 200 feet, 8 guns firing continuously, bombs releasing at precisely calculated distances, then pulling up through smoke and spray. The Japanese convoy dissolved into chaos. Transport ships were burning and sinking. Destroyers attempted to engage the attacking aircraft, but the Mitchells were too low and too fast. By the time a destroyer's 5-inch guns could track a target, the target had already released its bombs and was pulling away. The entire first attack wave took less than 12 minutes. By 10:12 in the morning, 4 transport ships were sinking or dead in the water. The remaining 3 transports scattered, attempting to reach Leh independently. The destroyers broke formation to pick up survivors from the water. Above the carnage, P-38 fighters engaged Japanese Zeros in a massive dogfight that prevented the Japanese fighters from interfering with the bombers below. The modified A-20 Havocs followed the Mitchells, adding their firepower to the devastation. More bombs skipped into burning hulls. More nose guns raked survivors in the water. It was not humane. It was not chivalrous. It was industrial-scale killing directed at men who had sailed from Rabaul 3 days earlier, believing they would land safely at Leh. By noon on March 3rd, only 3 transport ships remained afloat, all damaged, all attempting to flee north back toward Rabaul. The Japanese convoy had been effectively destroyed in less than 3 hours of sustained attack. But Allied aircraft continued searching throughout the afternoon. B-25 Mitchells found the destroyer Asagumo towing the damaged transport Taime Maru. More skip-bombing attacks sent both vessels to the bottom. March 4, 1943. The final act of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Allied reconnaissance aircraft located the surviving transport ships attempting to reach Rabaul. More B-25's and B-17's attacked throughout the day. By evening, all 8 transport ships had been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been destroyed. The remaining 4 destroyers, heavily damaged, limped back toward Rabaul, carrying fewer than 1,300 survivors from the nearly 7,000 men who had sailed 3 days earlier. The statistics told a story of technological and tactical revolution. 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 2,900 Japanese soldiers and sailors killed. Approximately 3,800 rescued by surviving destroyers and submarines, most of them wounded, many suffering from fuel oil exposure and immersion injuries. Of the soldiers who did reach Leh, fewer than 800 were fit for combat. Allied losses in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were remarkably light. 13 aircrew killed, 12 wounded, 4 aircraft destroyed in combat, 1 B-17 and 3 P-38 fighters, 2 additional aircraft destroyed in crash landings after battle damage. The exchange ratio was staggering: 13 Allied deaths against 2,900 Japanese deaths, 4 Allied aircraft destroyed against 8 transport ships, and 4 destroyers sunk. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that air power could achieve what naval theorists had debated since Billy Mitchell sank the Kareli. Captured German battleship Ostfriesland in 1921. Aircraft could destroy a defended convoy without surface ship or submarine support. The key was not high-altitude precision bombing. The key was low-altitude overwhelming firepower combined with skip-bombing tactics that gave ships no time to maneuver. Paul Gunn's modifications had made the difference. Without the 8 forward-firing 50s, the B-25's could not have suppressed defensive fire effectively. Without suppression, skip-bombing would have been suicide. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners would have torn apart bombers making straight-in approaches at 200 feet. The nose guns changed the equation. 30 seconds of continuous fire from 8 50s killed exposed personnel, destroyed gun positions, shattered bridge glass. By the time the Mitchell reached bomb release point, defensive fire had been eliminated or reduced to ineffective levels. General Kenny's report to General Douglas MacArthur emphasized the tactical innovation. The modified B-25 strafers, firing their nose guns continuously during their approach, destroyed or suppressed anti-aircraft positions on enemy ships, permitting accurate skip-bombing attacks with minimal losses. MacArthur, never one for understatement, declared the Battle of the Bismarck Sea a decisive aerial engagement that demonstrates the absolute supremacy of air power properly employed. The Japanese response to the disaster was immediate and far-reaching. The loss of an entire convoy with its embarked division meant Japanese forces at Lae and Salamaua could not be reinforced. Without reinforcements, those positions could not be held. The Bismarck Sea defeat contributed directly to the eventual Allied conquest of eastern New Guinea by late 1943. More significantly, Japanese naval doctrine changed. Prior to March 1943, Japanese planners believed convoy operations with adequate fighter cover and destroyer screens could transit hostile waters with acceptable losses. The Bismarck Sea demonstrated otherwise. Low-level aircraft attacks with overwhelming firepower could destroy convoys regardless of defensive measures. From March 1943 forward, major Japanese convoys would only sail under cover of darkness or heavy weather. Daylight convoy operations in contested waters effectively ceased. The Imperial Japanese Army issued a directive following the battle requiring all soldiers to learn swimming. Prior to Bismarck Sea, swimming was not considered essential military training. After watching thousands of soldiers drown in the minutes between their ships sinking and destroyer rescue, swimming became mandatory. The directive would not save lives. Most men drowning in fuel oil-covered water died from oil ingestion and hypothermia, regardless of swimming ability. But the directive revealed Japanese recognition that their soldiers could no longer count on safe passage or forward positions. News of the victory spread rapidly through Allied forces. Newspaper headlines proclaimed, "Jap convoy smashed." Radio broadcasts described the most devastating aerial attack of the Pacific War. American morale, still recovering from the disasters of 1941 and early 1942, received a massive boost. The Bismarck Sea proved American air power could achieve decisive tactical victories against determined opposition. For Paul Gunn, the battle vindicated 8 months of improvised engineering. His modifications, created from salvaged parts in makeshift workshops, had destroyed an enemy convoy. But Gunn could not celebrate. His wife and 4 children remained imprisoned at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. Every day they survived. Japanese captivity was another day he had not seen them. Every battle won brought Allied forces marginally closer to liberating the Philippines. But marginally closer still meant years away. North American aviation took immediate notice of Gunn's field modifications. Company engineers examined the modified aircraft and incorporated the design changes into factory production. By late 1943, B-25G models were entering service with factory-installed solid noses and heavy forward-firing armament. The B-25H model, introduced in 1944, featured even more forward armament, with 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns as standard equipment. Some H models mounted 18 forward-firing 50s, the firepower of 3 P-51 Mustang fighters concentrated in a single medium bomber. Marine Corps PBJ squadrons, the Navy's designation for B-25's, would employ these heavily armed variants in night attacks against Japanese shipping throughout 1944 and 1945. But the transition from field modification to factory production created new problems. Kenny had wanted commerce destroyers, aircraft that could attack shipping at low altitude with overwhelming firepower. North American aviation and Army Air Force procurement wanted to add more capabilities. The B-25G model included a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose alongside the machine guns. The theory was sound. A single 75mm shell could sink small vessels or cripple larger ones. But the implementation proved problematic. The cannon was manually loaded, achieving a rate of fire of approximately 4 rounds per minute. The gun's recoil caused significant stress on the airframe. The muzzle blast created smoke and fumes that filled the cockpit. Worst of all, the cannon's trajectory required precise range estimation. At low altitude, range errors of even 50 yards meant shells missing entirely. Crews, who flew G models with the 75mm cannon, reported mixed results. Against stationary targets like bridges or buildings, the cannon was effective. Against moving ships, the gun proved difficult to aim and slow to reload. Many units removed the 75mm cannon in the field and replaced it with additional 50-caliber machine guns. Some aircraft had 4 additional 50s installed in the nose, bringing the total to 14 forward-firing guns. The lesson was clear. Gunn's original concept of overwhelming machine gun fire at close range was more effective than attempting to mount artillery in an aircraft. The 50s worked. The 75mm cannon, despite its impressive specifications, added weight and complexity without proportional increase in effectiveness against the targets B-25's actually engaged. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25's continued to devastate Japanese shipping and installations across the Southwest Pacific. The tactics pioneered at Bismarck Sea became standard doctrine. Low-altitude attacks with nose guns firing to suppress defenses, skip bombing against ships, parafrag bombs against airfields and troop concentrations. The Mitchell had evolved from a medium-altitude bomber into a low-level attack aircraft that specialized in destroying targets that high-altitude bombers could not hit effectively. The November 2, 1943 raid on Rabaul demonstrated the continued effectiveness of the strafer tactics. 72 B-25's attacked Simpson Harbor in coordinated waves, their nose guns blazing as they raked Japanese cruisers and destroyers with machine gun fire. The attacks damaged 6 cruisers, some severely. 8 B-25's were shot down by intense anti-aircraft fire, and Major Raymond Wilkins was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the raid. But the mission achieved its objective. The Japanese cruiser force withdrew from Rabaul, removing the threat to Allied operations in Bougainville. By late 1944, Japanese surface shipping had been largely eliminated from contested waters. Submarines and PT boats accounted for most of the sinkings by that point, but the psychological impact of the strafer bombers remained. Japanese sailors and soldiers knew that any daylight movement in waters within range of Allied airfields meant near-certain destruction. The modified Mitchells had helped establish complete Allied air superiority throughout the Southwest Pacific. For Paul Gunn, the war continued with a personal dimension that transcended tactical victories. In October 1944, American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines. The liberation had begun. Allied forces advanced rapidly through the islands, overwhelming Japanese defenders who lacked reinforcements and supplies. By February 1945, American forces reached Manila. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division and 37th Infantry Division liberated the University of Santo Tomas internment camp. Among the 3,700 civilian prisoners were Clara Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 1 month of Japanese captivity, malnutrition, disease, brutality, but they had survived. Paul Gunn learned his family had been liberated while he was at 5th Air Force headquarters. The reunion came days later. A newspaperman who witnessed the moment described Gunn, normally stoic and taciturn, weeping openly as he embraced his wife and children. The man who had transformed Pacific air tactics, who had destroyed countless enemy ships and installations, who had been promoted to major and then lieutenant colonel for his contributions, was at that moment simply a husband and father who had gotten his family back. Gunn continued serving through the war's end. He flew combat missions. He supervised aircraft modifications. He trained new pilots in strafer tactics. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Gunn had flown more than 400 combat missions and had been credited with destroying numerous enemy aircraft and ships. He retired from the Army Air Force as a full colonel in June 1948 due to physical disability, from wounds received during a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in late 1944. After the war, Gunn returned to the Philippines and re-established his airline. He flew charter operations throughout the islands he had helped liberate. On October 11, 1957, while flying a charter flight, Gunn's aircraft encountered severe weather. The plane crashed. Paul Irvin Gunn, age 57, was killed. He was buried with full military honors at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, not far from where he had served as a flight instructor 3 decades earlier. The official record of Gunn's military service lists a Distinguished Flying Cross, a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit, an Air Medal with oak leaf clusters, and numerous other decorations. But the statistics tell a more complete story. Aircraft modified under his supervision destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft on the ground, sank dozens of ships, and supported ground operations throughout the Southwest Pacific campaign. The modified B-25 became one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific theater, and its effectiveness traced directly to innovations Gunn developed in makeshift workshops using salvaged parts. The broader impact of the modified B-25s extended beyond individual battles. The aircraft proved that medium bombers could be adapted for low-altitude attack roles previously reserved for dedicated attack aircraft. The firepower concentration achieved by mounting multiple heavy machine guns in the nose influenced post-war attack aircraft design. The Douglas Aoni Skyraider, which would enter service in 1946, incorporated lessons learned from the modified Mitchells, including heavy forward-firing armament and the ability to carry diverse weapons loads for different mission types. The success of skip bombing influenced anti-shipping tactics for decades. While guided missiles would eventually replace unguided bombs for anti-ship attacks, the principle of low-altitude, high-speed approaches to minimize defensive reaction time remained valid. Soviet naval aviation adopted similar tactics for their anti-shipping aircraft through the Cold War era. The modified Mitchell's combat record demonstrated that properly executed low-altitude attacks could overwhelm ship defenses, regardless of technological sophistication. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea itself entered military history as a case study in effective air-sea interdiction. Staff colleges worldwide analyzed the battle, examining the coordination between different aircraft types, the effectiveness of various weapons and tactics, and the intelligence preparation that enabled Allied forces to position their assets optimally. The battle demonstrated that maritime air superiority could prevent enemy reinforcement of land positions, effectively isolating enemy garrisons without direct assault. Japanese military analysis of the Bismarck Sea disaster focused heavily on the failure of air cover to protect the convoy. 100 Japanese fighters had been assigned to protect 8 transports and 8 destroyers. Yet Allied aircraft had destroyed the convoy with relatively light losses. Japanese after-action reports noted that Allied fighters successfully separated the Japanese fighters from the bombers, allowing the strafer bombers to attack with minimal interference. The reports recommended increased fighter strength for convoy protection and avoidance of daylight transits through contested waters. But the Japanese never developed an effective counter to the strafer tactics. Their anti-aircraft armament on transport ships was inadequate to stop determined low-altitude attacks. Their fighter doctrine emphasized high-altitude interception, not low-altitude combat above wave, tops where the modified Mitchells operated. By the time Japanese forces adapted their tactics, Allied air superiority was so complete that convoy operations had become impossible, regardless of defensive measures. The human cost of the Bismarck Sea cannot be separated from the tactical analysis. 2,900 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the battle. Most drowned when their ships sank. Some died from strafing attacks while swimming in the water. The Allied pilots who conducted follow-up attacks on survivors in lifeboats and rafts described the missions as the most disturbing actions they participated in during the war. Killing armed enemies in combat was one thing. Strafing helpless men in the water was something else entirely. The morality of attacking survivors generated debate among Allied aircrew. Some pilots refused to fire on men in the water. Others argued that every Japanese soldier who drowned was one fewer soldier Allied ground forces would face in subsequent battles. The orders to attack survivors came from high command, justified by the doctrine that destroying enemy military forces was legitimate, regardless of their immediate tactical situation. The pilots who flew those missions carried the psychological burden for the rest of their lives. But war strips away the luxury of clean moral choices. The same Japanese forces Allied pilots killed in the Bismarck Sea would have, if landed successfully at Lai, participated in operations that killed Allied soldiers and airmen. The modified Mitchells that destroyed the convoy prevented those Japanese soldiers from reaching their destination. Whether killing them in the water was more or less moral than killing them in jungle combat after they landed is a question with no satisfying answer. What remains indisputable is the tactical effectiveness. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea achieved complete destruction of an enemy convoy at minimal cost to Allied forces. The modified B-25's, product of improvised engineering by a retired Navy mechanic, had proven decisively superior to standard bombing tactics. The victory influenced pacificwar strategy for the remainder of the conflict. By war's end, the B-25 Mitchell had flown more combat missions than any other American medium bomber. Approximately 9,800 Mitchells were produced during the war. They served in every theatre, from the Aleutian Islands to North Africa, from the Mediterranean to the Southwest Pacific. They flew as high-altitude bombers, low-altitude strafers, anti-shipping attack aircraft, photo reconnaissance platforms, and even torpedo bombers in some Marine Corps units. But the variant that most influenced the Pacific War was the strafer bomber that Paul Gunn created in Australian workshops in mid-1942. That aircraft, with its 8 or more forward-firing 50s and its skip-bombing capability, transformed maritime air warfare. It gave Allied forces a weapon that could sink ships without requiring torpedo bombers to make slow, vulnerable attack runs. It provided firepower that could suppress anti-aircraft defenses during the attack approach. It proved that innovation born from necessity could be more effective than carefully engineered solutions developed in peacetime. The B-25 strafer entered service as an improvisation. It ended the war as one of the most successful anti-shipping aircraft ever built. The transition from field modification to factory production took less than a year. The impact lasted decades, influencing attack aircraft design through the jet age. Today, only a handful of B-25's remain airworthy. The aircraft fly at air shows and memorial events, their distinctive twin radial engines and high cockpit profile immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with World War II aviation. When a restored Mitchell flies overhead, often painted in the markings of units that flew in the Pacific, observers are witnessing a weapon system that changed the course of the Pacific War. The aircraft that Paul Gunn modified in Brisbane warehouses in 1942 accomplished what standard doctrine said was impossible. They sank ships from low altitude with unguided bombs. They suppressed anti-aircraft defenses with machine gun fire. They achieved kill ratios that exceeded the wildest predictions of pre-war planners. They did all of this because a 53-year-old retired Navy mechanic refused to accept that high-altitude bombing was the only way to attack ships. Gunn's story reveals a truth about warfare that technological sophistication often obscures. Innovation frequently comes not from advanced laboratories but from frontline personnel who understand the problem intimately and possess the technical skills to create solutions. Gunn knew ships. He knew aircraft. He knew machine guns. He understood that ships could not be hit reliably from 10,000 feet, but could be destroyed with a certainty from 200 feet if the attacking aircraft could survive the approach. The 850s in the nose made survival possible. They killed the gunners who would otherwise kill the bomber crews. That was the innovation. Not complicated, not sophisticated. 8 machine guns firing forward. But those 8 guns, combined with skip bombing tactics and aggressive pilots willing to fly at wave-top height, destroyed Japanese naval logistics throughout the Southwest Pacific. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The final casualty figures from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea bear repeating because they demonstrate the revolution in maritime warfare that Gunn's modifications enabled. 8 Japanese transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 2,900 Japanese personnel killed, 13 Allied aircrew killed, 4 Allied aircraft lost in combat. Those numbers represent not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental shift in how naval warfare would be conducted for the remainder of World War II and beyond. The age of the battleship had ended at Midway. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that the age of defended convoy transit through hostile airspace had also ended. Air power, properly employed with appropriate aircraft and tactics, could deny the seas to any surface force. The modified B-25 Mitchell, born in a workshop in Brisbane from salvaged parts and the ingenuity of a retired Navy mechanic, had rewritten the rules of war at sea. The aircraft that North American aviation designed as a medium-altitude bomber became a low-altitude commerce destroyer that sank more Japanese ships than many surface vessels. The transformation happened not in factories or design bureaus, but in the field, driven by operational necessity and implemented by men who understood that survival required innovation. Paul Gunn's legacy extends beyond the specific modifications he pioneered. His approach to problem-solving, his willingness to work outside official channels, his ability to see solutions where others saw only limitations, these qualities represent the best traditions of military innovation. The modified Mitchell exists because Gunn refused to accept that the aircraft had to be employed according to its original design specifications. He saw a different possibility and possessed the technical skills to make that possibility real. The pilots and crews who flew the modified Mitchells in combat understood what Gunn's work meant. They were flying aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. The nose guns suppressed defensive fire. The skip bombing tactics allowed accurate attacks at altitudes below most anti-aircraft envelopes. The combination of firepower and tactics meant crews could attack defended ships and expect to return to base. That expectation made all the difference between suicidal desperation and aggressive confidence. By war's end, the modified B-25 had become so successful that its field modification origins were largely forgotten. New crews arriving in theatre assumed the aircraft had always been designed as a strafer bomber. The official histories focus on the battles won, the ships sunk, the missions flown. But behind every mission was the work Gunn had done in Brisbane warehouses, salvaging machine guns from wrecked fighters and figuring out how to mount them in bombers that were never designed to carry such armament. The story of the B-25 strafer is ultimately a story about human ingenuity under pressure. When standard tactics failed, when aircraft proved inadequate for their assigned missions, when losses mounted without corresponding results, innovation became survival. Paul Gunn provided that innovation. The modified Mitchell became the weapon that turned the tide of the maritime war in the Southwest Pacific. The aircraft that destroyed the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, should never have existed. By all the rules of military procurement and aircraft design, medium bombers were supposed to attack from altitude with bombardiers using optical sights. But the rules did not work in the Pacific. Ships moved too fast. The distances were too great. The losses were too high. Gunn broke the rules. He pulled machine guns from crashed fighters. He stripped transparent noses from bombers. He created a weapon system that violated every design assumption North American aviation had made when they drew the Mitchell's blueprints. And that weapon system won battles, sank ships, saved lives, and changed warfare. That is the legacy of Pappy Gunn and the modified B-25 Mitchell. Not the aircraft that was designed, but the aircraft that was necessary. Not the tactics that were taught, but the tactics that worked. Not the war as planned, but the war as fought. The Japanese convoy that sailed from Rabaul on February 28, 1943, represented Japanese confidence that their military could still execute complex operations in contested waters. The convoy carried trained infantry, experienced officers, essential supplies. It sailed with destroyer escorts and fighter cover. By all the assumptions of early 1943, the convoy should have reached Leh with acceptable losses. Instead, the convoy was annihilated. Every transport sunk, half the destroyers destroyed. Fewer than 20% of the embarked personnel survived to reach land. The convoy's destruction demonstrated that Japanese assumptions about convoy security were obsolete. Air power, properly employed, could sink any surface force regardless of defensive measures. The weapon that proved Japanese assumptions wrong was a modified bomber that had been created by a mechanic working with salvaged parts in Australian warehouses. That fact reveals something profound about the nature of warfare and innovation. The most sophisticated technology means nothing if it cannot be adapted to actual combat conditions. The most carefully planned operations fail if the enemy can counter them with simple but effective responses. Paul Gunn's simple but effective response was 8 machine guns in a bomber's nose. Those 8 guns, combined with skip-bombing tactics and aggressive crews, destroyed Japanese logistics capabilities throughout the Southwest Pacific. The modified Mitchell did not win the Pacific War alone, but it made victory possible by denying Japanese forces the ability to reinforce and supply their forward positions. That is what battlefield innovation accomplishes. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but incremental advantages that compound over time. The modified Mitchell gave Allied forces an advantage in maritime interdiction. That advantage prevented Japanese reinforcement of New Guinea. The lack of reinforcements led to the loss of Japanese positions throughout the theatre. The loss of positions led to American advance toward the Philippines. The liberation of the Philippines led to the strategic isolation of Japan. The chain of causation runs from Gunn's workshop modifications to Japanese surrender. Not directly, not simply, but the connection exists. The modified B-25 was one element among many that contributed to Allied victory, but it was an essential element, created not by design bureaus but by improvisation, not by following doctrine but by questioning it, not by accepting limitations but by engineering solutions. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as the most dramatic demonstration of what Gunn's modifications made possible. But the tactics pioneered in that battle influenced air operations for the remainder of the war. Low-altitude attacks with heavy forward-firing armament became standard doctrine for medium bombers in the Pacific. The modified Mitchell's success proved that medium bombers did not need to be restricted to medium-altitude operations. With appropriate weapons and tactics, medium bombers could accomplish missions previously reserved for attack aircraft. The operational flexibility this created was enormously valuable. The same Mitchell squadron could fly high-altitude bombing missions against airfields one day and low-altitude shipping strikes the next. The aircraft's versatility meant Allied air forces could adapt quickly to changing tactical situations without waiting for specialized aircraft to arrive. By the war's final months, modified Mitchells were performing missions their designers never imagined. Night intruder operations, photo reconnaissance, skip bombing attacks against bridges, ground support missions with rockets and parafrag bombs. The aircraft that began the war as a conventional medium bomber had evolved into a multi-role attack platform that could accomplish almost any mission assigned. That evolution started in Paul Gunn's workshop in Brisbane. The retired Navy mechanic who salvaged machine guns from wrecked fighters and bolted them into a bomber's nose created something that transcended its origins. He created a new category of combat aircraft, the strafer bomber, heavily armed for forward fire, optimized for low-altitude attacks, capable of both suppressing defenses and delivering weapons accurately. The concept would influence attack aircraft design for decades. The Aoni Sky Raider incorporated lessons from the modified Mitchell. The Arton Thunderbolt's 30mm cannon and armored cockpit represent a direct evolution of the strafer concept. Modern attack helicopters employ the same basic principle, overwhelming forward firepower to suppress defenses while closing to release range. Paul Gunn never designed an aircraft, he modified one. But that modification influenced military aviation more than many purpose-designed aircraft ever did. The modified Mitchell proved that forward firepower and low-altitude tactics could achieve results impossible with conventional bombing approaches. That proof changed how the world thought about air-to-ground attack. The Japanese convoy destroyed in the Bismarck Sea learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. The soldiers crammed below decks in the transport ships believed they were sailing to reinforce critical positions. Instead, they sailed into a new form of warfare they were unprepared to counter. The aircraft that killed them did not attack from altitude with bombs that gave warning. The aircraft came in at wave height with machine guns firing continuously and bombs that skipped into hulls with no warning at all. There was no defense. The convoy's anti-aircraft guns could not suppress the attackers. The fighter cover could not prevent the low-altitude attacks. The destroyer escorts could not screen the transports effectively against bombers approaching at 200 feet. The convoy was destroyed because Allied air forces had developed a tactic that Japanese naval doctrine could not counter. That tactic existed because Paul Gunn refused to accept that medium bombers had to attack from medium altitude. His refusal, backed by mechanical ingenuity and salvaged parts, created the weapon that proved him right. The modified B-25 Mitchell stands as evidence that innovation matters more than resources, that improvisation can defeat sophisticated defenses, that a retired mechanic working in a warehouse can change the course of a war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the proof. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, a convoy annihilated, and 13 Allied aircrew killed achieving those results. The mathematics of that exchange ratio reveal what Gunn's modifications accomplished. Allied forces could project devastating power against enemy shipping with acceptable losses. That capability transformed the Pacific War from a struggle for contested sea lanes into an American march toward Tokyo protected by absolute air superiority. The modified Mitchell made that march possible, not by itself, but as one essential element in a comprehensive application of air power that eventually overwhelmed Japanese resistance. The aircraft that should never have existed, created by a mechanic who salvaged parts and violated design assumptions, became one of the Pacific War's most effective weapons. That is the story of innovation in warfare. Not predictable, not planned, not the result of massive industrial programs, but the product of individual ingenuity applied to immediate problems by people who understood both the problem and the tools available to solve it. Paul Gunn understood ships, aircraft, and machine guns. He understood that ships died when machine gun fire killed their gunners and bombs exploded in their hulls. He created an aircraft that could kill gunners and deliver bombs accurately at ranges where ships could not maneuver. That understanding, translated into modifications performed with salvaged parts, changed the Pacific War. The convoy that sailed from Rabaul in late February 1943 sailed into the teeth of that change. The Japanese never saw it coming, and by the time they understood what had happened, it was too late to matter. The modified Mitchell had proven itself. The tactics had been validated, and American industry would build thousands more Mitchells, incorporating Gunn's modifications as standard equipment. The mechanic's improvisation had become America's weapon, and that weapon, combined with the courage of the men who flew it into anti-aircraft fire at wavetop height, helped win the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.